Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Paul Fahey. I'm a Vice President with Overit, and we're glad that you're here. Welcome to our friends that are joining us on Zoom. This is also being restreamed on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook platforms. So you're here because you want to know how to protect your brand when things don't go according to plan. And that's what we'll share over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. We'll take you through quick introduction. What is a crisis? Sounds kind of, silly question, but some are easier to spot than others. And we'll talk about how to respond to this at the business level. We're going to try to make this conversation as practical as possible. You'll hear us talk a lot about it from a media relations standpoint, largely because that's sometimes where news breaks, sometimes where our clients hear about things even before the public does. And certainly where news can get amplified. But we'll also talk a fair amount about social media, largely how can you prepare for a crisis, how can you interact with the public. We'll share with you the PAIR acronym, P-E-A-R. You'll see this on your screen, and we'll talk about that. I think that's a great tool to help you remember how to manage and deal with a crisis. We'll talk about press and social media messages and tips that you can put into action to essentially protect your brand and minimize damage from a downturn. At some point, every organization faces some sort of downturn, whether it's a small, large, acute, sudden, smoldering. But it's important to know how to handle it because, as you'll hear us say, how you handle it is what people often remember more than the situation itself. So what's keeping you up at night? I mean, this conversation's tailored to home service companies, but really this could be any organization. I think what we were thinking about as we were talking to some of our clients and folks, frankly, that have had to deal with these issues over the last, several years, there's a number of different things that could go wrong in any particular type of business. But for the home service companies, in particular, you have the generic set of things that could go wrong with any company. But where you're a little bit more unique is that your employees are interacting very closely with your customers and very often are being welcomed into their homes. And that has the potential for, a certain set of challenges. So what is keeping us up at night? We've been looking at COVID rates like we were looking at Barry Bonds scores during any particular season, watching to see what's happening and how is that influencing what we can do with our business and how we can keep moving forward in servicing our clients. So does that sound familiar? Is that what's keeping us up at night? Are we masked and vaxxed, and can we continue to do business as usual? Can we bring people into our homes? Should we pause services? How do we do that? And that feels so 2020, right? Why are we talking about this now? Well, we're in the waning parts, at least certainly here nationwide. So it looks like we're past another COVID and flu season, but certainly the challenges that many of our clients were facing early in 2020, all of us were off balance. We didn't know what to do and what we could do and how long it would last. Looks like that's going to be the kind of thing we need to revisit seasonally. Well, the good news is many of us have adapted. We know how to respond to it. We've built in systems in place for it, so that's good. But there's also another set of challenges that have been plaguing this type of industry for quite some time. The other misadventures that you might see. And these are, sharing these as not to be alarmist and sensational, but really to point out what can and does and has happened to home service companies nationwide over the years. The most frequently cited story, the most frequently story that we've been able to obtain through our research is this, home theft. Typically, as you've seen in the stories here, it's stealing jewelry or other valuables. The other one is the medicine cabinet. So there have been some of those misadventures that some of our clients or other organizations have had to deal with. Generically, embezzlement happens to a lot of different companies, no matter what the industry is, but certainly these are news stories that do break. Your business in particular, very often, and whether you're in pest control, landscaping, pool and recreational service, you're dealing with a lot of chemistry, and so as a result, you fall to a lot of OSHA requirements. And so whether your organization makes the news for good or bad news with your ability to manage those, in this case, exposing employees to chemicals that might be outside of some of the training, or damage to wildlife and those kind of things. It can, does, and has happened. And even when it's not your employees, you get lumped into this. Somebody posing as a pest control employee was arrested for jewelry theft within somebody's home. So sometimes the whole industry gets brought down by a bad apple, so to speak. And hey, Paul, what do you know about this? Have you ever lived through it? Yeah, unfortunately, sadly, yes. In my past life, our agency, our bookkeeper stole nearly $1 million for us. So, had the opportunity to take what we train our clients on and turn it onto ourselves with regard to how do we manage our reputations and brands throughout this whole, endeavor. So why does this matter? Certainly there are a lot of fundamentals within your organization's brand. Any home service brand will have reliability, competence, cost, all those things baked into it, but there's an underlying sense of trust. I am quite literally welcoming you into my home. Now, I feel better when you show up and you're uniformed and your vehicle looks pretty nice and you haven't parked on the lawn and run over my new flowers. Your employees are wiping their feet, or even better, putting on booties and all those kind of things. All of those you spend a ton of time training for to reinforce and build that trust. And I think that's the core of what we're going to talk about today, because your brand has value. That asset has to be nurtured and should be managed the same way that your tangible assets are, and this is one way to do it. Again, as I mentioned before, people remember how a crisis was handled, longer than the details of the crisis itself. If somebody lied, if somebody, went and said no comment, if they were ducking the press. And, very often we hear clients say, I don't need to talk to the media, it's just going to end up with nothing but hassle. If you're not telling your story, somebody else will tell it for you, and they won't tell it the way you want it told. Long-term damage to your organization can certainly happen before and after a crisis, more so than during the crisis. Being proactive, to my comment a moment ago, really helps to minimize damage. It improves morale among your employees, it encourages healing, depending on what the nature of the situation is. And depending on how long a crisis goes, that need for communication grows the longer it is. The examples that we gave earlier, very often these are what we call one-day stories, but they will resonate with folks, and unfortunately they'll stay with Google forever. So when people start typing in your organization's name, these pages from very high-ranking authorities such as news websites, will start to, appear, and that's not what you want. So the faster we can get past it, the faster we can control the conversation and shift the debate, the better off we will be. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the news media in particular, can have a significant long-term impact on your perception, and that's why it's so important and why you'll hear us talk a fair amount about managing the media throughout this process. So crisis, how do you define it? What does it look like? The textbook definition, I'm not going to read word for word here, but it's basically anything that is adverse to your business plans, anything that's negatively impacting your ability to deliver on your business plan, to move your organization forward, whether that's growing, expanding, or even simply maintaining the status quo. These are things that will distract you in a negative manner from those opportunities. That's a crisis. Now, there's a couple different crises. Certainly COVID checks that box clearly, and you'll hear us talk about that. COVID falls into the second category of more of a, well, it was kind of sudden at first and now it's smoldering, but we'll talk about two different types of crises that your organization's likely to fall. Whatever the issue is likely to fall into one of these two different categories. The first is sudden. This is a mass shooting, a fire, an employee arrest, something else like that. It's unexpected. There's initial chaos followed by aftershocks. You can prepare for them, just in the event that something might happen. How might you respond through some training? It's very important to establish facts early on, use consistent messages. This is true of anything else. Speed is essential. Sometimes, depending on the nature of the situation, you need to be ready for full-time 24/7 media coverage. And it's essential that you're constantly updating and sharing information. Again, if you're not telling your story, somebody else is. You can expect that, in the case of a sudden issue, employee is injured, employee death, whatever it could be, issuing a press release, stepping in front of the cameras for a moment isn't enough. You need to be able to, and we'll talk about how to respond, the appropriate steps and processes, but constantly updating folks, even if you have nothing new to say. Social media is a great tool for this. You don't have to convene a press conference, every so often, but just constantly updating folks based on new facts that you have, information that you have, what you're doing internally throughout the whole process can be very reassuring, comforting, and again, people will see how you're responding to a situation, and especially if it's being managed properly, and that helps to recover your brand, perception and minimize the damage. To that end, there's this famous quote that Winston Churchill said, "When the eagles are silent, the parrots begin to jabber." If you're not telling your story, somebody else will. If you're not out there with constant updates, if you're not controlling the message to the best of your ability, a reporter, a neighbor, somebody else on social media will do that for you, and they don't always get it right. The reporters don't always report it the right way also. Sometimes you're selectively quoted. We'll talk about that. But it's important to be out there frequently with consistent messages. The second type of crisis is what we call smoldering. This could be an embezzlement that you're learning about over time. OSHA notifies you and you know that it's happening before it hits the press. The coronavirus pandemic initially was pretty acute for many of us, but then, is a bit of a smoldering crisis, and feel like we're kind of turning a corner there. These are more likely to occur. Sometimes they're difficult to identify in early stages. It's easy to misjudge these. It's very easy to say, I'm not sure if this is going to be a big deal. OSHA cites everybody for a violation of this type or whatever, but again, the wrong set of circumstances can mean that a routine piece of paperwork or a very low-level violation could all of a sudden on a slow news day and with the wrong triggers become a news story. Sometimes they go away on their own. All of these, I think both types of crises, will reflect on the quality and ability of leaders. This is where you as organization leaders will be tested unlike you ever will, in other times in your career. Your ability to bring people together for information gathering, problem solving, developing work plans, and showing that confident face as an organizational leader is more important during these times than any other. Think back to the first day when you stepped into the banker's office for the loan to start your business. That's a cakewalk compared to, how you're going to be tested in situations like this. And so as we pivot from what is a crisis into how you can manage it, we'll share some tips to hopefully help you weather the storm. So for the Boy Scouts in the audience, be prepared, that's their motto, and that's really core to all of this. I mean, the fact that you're watching this right now says that you want to be prepared, you want to know how to handle it. Perhaps you're in the audience because you're dealing with something might be coming, or you just want to know generically, what are the things I should do to make sure that I'm ready so that, I can hit the ground running when something happens. So preparing, and again, we run this through the media lens in this part of the conversation. Sometimes they learn about a crisis before you do, or they'll post something on social media. I'm old enough, I've got the gray hair. I've, over the course of my career, even had a few instances where clients got good news from a reporter that they weren't even aware of, and it turned into a bad news story. Hey, I understand your hospital is ranked top 100. Oh, there's a million hospitals with our name, Saint XYZ, around the country. You sure that's us? And then the headline reads, hospital can't believe they're in the top 100. So they may learn about it before you do. They may be talking to the police about something, or picking up on something before it even gets to your desk. Very often they're on site before you're ready. You don't have the ability to necessarily control when the satellite trucks or even just a single reporter walks through the lobby and says, I'd like to have a conversation. Depending on the nature of it, the situation, or depending on the nature of the reporter, it could be very adversarial. To the last point on this slide, people want to assign blame, and that reporter is taking that position on behalf of the public, and they want to know who did something wrong. They'll very often see the spokesperson as that spin doctor. The publicists aren't always the trusted voice. The CEO isn't always the trusted voice. Very often, and I can't remember if we have this on a subsequent slide, but we often talk about putting the right person, as the face of the organization, depending on the crisis. You don't want people that could be misread as the spin doctor, the PR person, or the bean counter that's just worried about the bottom line. For other clients like hospitals and health system clients of ours, we've recommended perhaps that the chief medical officer, the highest ranking medical person on staff, be that face of the organization because they understand the clinical issues. They took an oath. They understand bedside manner, and maybe that's a better face for whatever the particular situation is. So at the beginning of the presentation, when I talked about the outline, I mentioned the PAIR acronym, and I was hoping I would remember to actually bring one with me, but I think I can put one up on the screen. So the PAIR acronym will help you understand what to do and when to do it in what order. And it's important that you follow that acronym. There's our picture of the PAIR. So PAIR stands for people, environment, assets, and reputation. And it's important that you remember the acronym, and in particular, the purpose of the acronym is to remind you in what order you should be thinking about things and handling things. This is the order in which you should be dealing with a situation itself, and this is the order in which you should be messaging and communicating with the public. So for example, there's a fire. One of your plants, your building, your operations building has a fire. Well, people first, get everybody out. Environment second. Let's make sure the neighbor's house doesn't catch on fire and that this doesn't spread. What can we do to help prevent that? That may not be your responsibility, it might be the fire department, but that's the second thing you should be thinking about. Then your own assets. Let's make sure we put our fire out and see what we can salvage out of our own building. And lastly, the reputation. Well, who's to blame and how did it start and could this have been prevented and all of those other things. That's the order in which you're going to handle that particular example, and that's also the order in which you should handle and speak to the public about those things. And if you go out of order, bad things happen. So some PAIR lessons that you can learn from some other folks. Remember Deepwater Horizon, I think this was 2011 or 12. BP's oil rig, Gulf of Mexico, deepwater drilling, had a pretty tragic explosion, and there were, I think, 11 employees that were killed. The CEO, at some point several days later, remarked about the amount of time that he was spending just focusing on the Deepwater Horizon. This is a multi-billion-dollar, organization, market cap probably approaching $1 trillion. Tony Hayward had basically said, and I think his quote was, well, I want my life back. I want to get this behind us and get this whole thing resolved, forgetting that 11 of his employees died on his rig. And that was a good example of going out of order, thinking about not only reputation, your own personal needs, as opposed to putting your people first and going through that series and that sequence. So let's share some tips on managing the media and, again, social media. How can, whatever the situation is that you're in, how can you be prepared, and what are some tips? And this is, kind of a light example of some of the things that we cover in our media training or even social media training. So first, preparing messages for the media. The number one rule, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, take the PAIR acronym and the number one rule. It's not about answering the reporter's questions, it's about delivering your message. And you'll see this, some of us catch it from time to time and they say, hey, the reporter asked that question, but the elected official, Senator so-and-so, didn't quite answer that question. They just said whatever they wanted to say. It's not about answering their question, it's about delivering your message. And we'll talk about how to be able to deliver your message without obviously being rude about it. Kissinger was famous for saying this, does anybody have any questions for my answers? Ask whatever you want, I'm going to say what I want to say. Again, you don't want to do it with that level of arrogance or be that blunt in a crisis, but my point is you want to be able to control your message. So when you're preparing for the media, when you understand what's happening, when you have a sense of what the facts are, what the crisis is that you're dealing with, developing those key messages, writing it down on a piece of paper. Love taking phone interviews with radio news outlets because I can have my notes right there and I don't have to look as if I'm reading down or whatever. But having that set of key messages is essential. Finding out who else is being interviewed. These are good intake questions when the reporter calls. Hey, let me make sure I get you in touch with the right person. So before I put him or her on the phone or have us call you back, let me ask a little bit about this. What is it you're calling in reference to? Oh, okay, it's this crisis. Who else have you talked to already? That's important to know. If you've already spoken to the police or the family that was involved or something else, that gives me a sense of what you already know. What kind of questions do we think they'll ask? Who's the right spokesperson that we talked about earlier? And really, really, very, very important, knowing and respecting their deadline. Understanding from the reporter, hey, you're calling me at 12:30 Eastern time. I'd like to get the right person involved. Who else are you talking to? What's this in reference to? And what's your deadline? Okay, you need to get a story on air by 5 o'clock. Well, let me see if I can get back to you within the hour. Is that okay? Will that work for you? Very important because, again, if you're not respectful of their deadline, if you're calling them at the minutes before their airtime or before their story has to go to press, they're going to tell your story for you. One of the themes from today's presentation. So in terms of some of those strategies for preparing messages, fighting emotion with emotion, anger at those who've misbehaved, sympathy for those who've harmed. Situation can't always be about the facts. Putting a human face on a crisis. How do you humanize your organization? How do you make it personal by, helping people, putting people out there, engaging third parties, other trade associations that you might belong to or elected officials that could speak to the situation that you're, dealing with. Again, these are just some very shorthand things to keep in mind. But if the situation is emotional, respond with emotion and facts. Try to humanize it. Try to engage third parties for points of view on, whatever the situation could be. The local fire department, might be more sympathetic to how things can happen. It doesn't seem like gross negligence on your part when this is something that's unfortunately common, whatever. Be honest 100% of the time. If you don't know the answer, say so. Don't exaggerate. Don't answer a question you don't understand. It's perfectly acceptable to say, could you just repeat it or rephrase that question? I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. And always tell the truth. It will 100% come back to you. I promise you it happens more often than not. And again, that goes to our earlier point that people will remember how you handled a crisis, sometimes more than the crisis itself. Crisis might be pretty simple. Sorry that this employee stole from you in your home. We got back the stolen goods. We want to make it up to you. How can we, say that we're sorry? But if you're lying anywhere in there, the story the next day could be a one-day story, but the story the next day is now, about this, and you've dug yourself even deeper, and it sustains it, and it puts you in obviously a very bad light. Remember, number one rule, I repeat it throughout here, not about answering their question, it's about delivering your message. So many of our clients say, I don't want to talk to the media, nothing good can come from it, I don't like it, they've got cameras, they've got bright lights in my face, they're gonna, selectively quote me. So let's dispel a few myths. The media will not wait for all the facts. They won't always put everything in context when they're covering it. Reporters don't always play it the way you say it. You may be selectively quoted. All media is not the same. They have bias. They have different things that they cover and different things that are important to them. So it's not to say that the media is out to get you. It's just that they have a story that they want to report to the people that watch it. They know it's important to their viewers, and they want to capture that story, frankly, on a daily basis, 24 hours a day in some cases. So it's important to keep, that in mind as you're preparing for it. So with that in mind, a few tips, and again, we can make this PowerPoint available, or you can start, if you're watching this on demand in the future, you can obviously pause. But having that very short, simple, quick list of 3 key points, accentuating the positive, don't volunteer the negative. Nothing is ever off the record, ever. Can we go off the record? Sure, but then you just told me something that I have to, need to, want to follow up on. Never say no comment. We'll talk about that in a second in terms of how you can do that. Being confident in your own expertise. Especially with regard to the type of business that you're in, the type of training you provide, how this could have been preventable because of all the things you do and, on behalf, all the investments you make in your employees. That's your expertise. You are an expert in how your organization is run. And be confident in that. You don't always have to play defense, necessarily with all of your messaging. Feel free to correct misinformation. If somebody says, I understand that this is one of the details or facts, that's actually not how it happened, and let me correct you on that. Never step into hypothetical situations. So what would you do if this happened again? Or, any of those kind of things. There are far too many variables in any hypothetical. The person asking a hypothetical will create a hypothetical with a single context in mind. Hey, we're talking about the theft from an employee. Well, this employee happened to get caught. Is it possible that this employee did it before? Is it possible other employees do this? Those are hypothetical situations that you never want to address. And again, we'll talk about how to avoid no comment, how to avoid getting into hypotheticals in just a moment. Repeating your key messages. Remember my number one rule? It's not about answering their question, it's about delivering your message. And fair to say, look, we don't respond to hypotheticals. There's just too many variables to consider, but I want to go back to my core message in a second. So the steering statements that you could use, when you're tempted to want to say no comment, when a reporter hits you with a hypothetical, things like, well, listen, what concerns me even more than what you're asking about is this, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that the safety of our employees and in particular our customers, is extremely important to us. Or, the real issue here is this, or I would describe it a little bit differently. This is how I would phrase what you just said. These are great statements that you can use to get back to delivering your message and not necessarily answering their questions, and definitely not saying no comment. So on my last slide, if you've prepared your 3 very brief key messages, very short and simple, having those and a couple of these steering statements at mind, would keep you very prepared for most situations. And a really important point about social media. So as a crisis happens, when something hits the news or people are talking about it, it's really, really important. Double check your scheduled social media posts. Very often, many of our clients use tools like Facebook or Hootsuite, HubSpot, and they'll schedule posts, let's just sit down for one working session and I'll have a whole month's worth of social media posts, and they automatically just deploy and post on autopilot. But you're going to appear very tone deaf if you have a particular crisis and then later that afternoon you're like, hey, we're running 5% off special on particular service. Always remember, the second something hits, hit the pause button until you can determine what's the right set of messages, what's the right tone. So stop the presses. As I mentioned before, social media is a great place to share updates, frequent updates, getting out there as often as possible. Don't feel as though, depending on the severity of the crisis, that you're perpetuating it. You certainly don't want to add more fuel to a fire necessarily, but you'll have a general sense of what the public wants to hear and how often they want to hear from you, depending on the severity of the situation. Much easier than a press conference and much faster to deploy information. Listening, Facebook in particular, boy, that's a mess around election season, isn't it? Just comments flying from everybody. But it's a great place to not only post information, but it's a great place to listen to, the comments. Sometimes it can be a bit of a storm, but very often it's a place to learn. How does the public feel about that? When you say this, does it sound like they believe you? Are they ready to embrace, your explanation? Are they ready to forgive you? It can be very much a very powerful listening tool as much as it can, a tool for you to push communication out. Consider pausing before responding. You may not need to, and what I mean by that is, very often if you have a deep base of loyal customers and something bad happens, sometimes those people that have been with you for decades are going to be the first voices to say, I know the story you're hearing feels to me, because I've known this organization, like that's an exception to the rule. That this is, not the organization I know, not the company I've known for all these years. Sometimes they're very quick to jump into your defense, and that feels better than just you saying, no, we're good. It's better when they say, no, they're good. Give them a second chance. So, to my point a moment ago about listening and learning, social media can be great for a listening tool. And if you start to track that data over time, and as you've heard us say on a lot of our other webinars, it's very important to look at that. What's the frequency of people posting and tagging about you? And what's the sentiment? Have we gone from positive, comments before this crisis to negative comments during this crisis? And now that we move past it, things are going from negative to neutral, starting to feel like positive. Look at those trends over time, and that'll give you a sense of where you're at. Be human, be conversational, be truthful, especially if the situation warrants it. Respond to an emotional situation with an emotion. Don't feel as though you have to have that, canned, safe, approved by legal phrase. As nicely crafted as it is, sometimes it feels a little too stiff and lacks that personal compassion that the situation warrants. So thinking ahead, unfortunately, there will always be a next time. And don't ever quote yourself, especially on your own presentation. But a good chess player does think a few moves ahead. So in the midst of the crisis, understand that this too shall pass, and get a sense for what you're going to say the next day, the next hour, the next month, and plan to ramp up those strategies and messages. How do they sound? If you're tracking social sentiment or even the news coverage, is it positive, negative, neutral? Where are we trending? Are people ready to forgive us? Have they put that behind us? Has Google indexed it on page 5 instead of page 1? All of that, I think, is important to help you with that planning. You don't want to blow the all-clear whistle too soon. You don't want to be one of those organizations that forgives yourself before the public forgives you. But getting a sense of what's that plan now, what are those strategies and messages that we need, moving forward? How does it sound? How do we think it's going to resonate based on the current tone and climate, on social media or in the media itself? So a few summary points. As I mentioned, the PAIR acronym is really important. It's about people. You make people's lives better. Communicate often, whatever you can do, as often as possible. Communicate regularly. People crave routines. If you say, I'm going to report every morning at 9 o'clock on this, or I'm going to have my Friday facts or Monday moments, we're going to send out, updates. That certainly helps you regain control of the narrative along the storyline. Keep listening through social media. How can your staff, your board, whoever else advises you, help you, guide you through this with the information? Listen to them. Listen to the employees that are on the front lines, your call centers, what you're going to hear on social media. Be human. It's okay. In the case of COVID, this is our first pandemic, our first global pandemic. We're all in this together. We're going to get through it. So in summary, be there for your people, your employees, your customers, your friends, your neighbors. They'll remember how you treated them long after this is over, how you responded to the situation more than the details of the situation itself. So thank you. We're all in this together, as I mentioned. And so for those of you on Zoom, didn't see any comments come through, although Katie's not joining me live in the studio. So if there were any comments from those folks, and for those of you watching and streaming on social media, we'll try to reply offline to the questions and comments that you have. So thank you for spending time with us. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope that these are some tips that will help you, preserve your reputation, your brand equity, minimizing damage from a downturn. So thanks for spending time with us. We'll see you at the next webinar.